everyone else, and I need to take my own advice. There's really no better way to get in touch with nature and really think about all of these aspects of environmental sustainability than fishing.
What's up, everyone? John here from the Cast and Spear podcast, and I'm super excited that you're with us today. I have Professor Greg Lutz from Louisiana State University. He is a professor of aquaculture, and aquaculture has been big on my mind because I'm always looking for ways that we can regenerate our oceans, and I think aquaculture is one of those ways to do it. So in this episode, we're going to cover what is aquaculture, how it can be used all over the world to replenish our fish stock so we can fish more, but also take care of the local communities in certain countries around the world, and then how you can get involved if you are interested in if aquaculture sounds good to you. Now, on a side note, we are going to be way more consistent with these podcasts. I have recorded a whole bunch of really thought-provoking interviews with some really awesome guests, and I'm going to try and get out one a week to you for the foreseeable future. Now, let's jump into this podcast where Greg starts talking about how he got interested in aquaculture.
It all really started when I was a little kid. I remember, I think I was about 6 or 7, and my dad bought an aquarium for Christmas, and I was just fascinated with that. And also, when I was young, I would go out with my dad to the river, and he would go fishing, and I didn't have the patience for that, so I would start turning over rocks trying to catch crayfish. And then I, got through high school, went to college. For a biology class, we had to do an independent study, an independent project on some organism that lived on the grounds of the college. And I wandered back in the backwoods and came across a stream, and I thought to myself, oh, I bet there's crawfish in there. And so I did my little project on that, and it was time to graduate, and I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. And I thought, well, I like to mess around with all these little crustaceans. And I came to the realization that crawfish farming, as we call them here in Louisiana, was a pretty up-and-coming business in Louisiana. And so I came to Louisiana and worked for another university just as like a farm tech, basic slave labor for about half a year. That was back in 1980, 81 maybe. And I realized, well, if I'm going to stay with this and do something with this, I need to go back to school. So I got accepted to work on my master's at LSU, and then I just hung around and got a PhD and got into a private operation for a while. We built a big catfish farm here in Louisiana. And then I got a call from LSU that there was an extension specialist position open, and applied, and I got that. I got that job, and that was in 1991, and I've been with LSU ever since then. So it started out, just with an interest in crawfish and things like that. But then, I learned a lot about other species. I learned a lot about catfish and tilapia and, just all sorts of things. And I can say I've been very fortunate to be exposed to all the different kinds of aquaculture that I've seen over the years, and be able to travel to a lot of places and learn a lot more than I ever could have just here in the university.
Well, before we get into some of your travels, can you give a little bit of a brief overview or a beginner's overview of what is aquaculture for those who don't know?
Honestly, if you ask 4 or 5 aquaculturists, what is aquaculture? Can you define aquaculture? You'll get 7 or 8 or 10 different answers. But the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, they have a formal definition of aquaculture, and I may not get it word for word, but basically it involves the cultivation of aquatic plants and animals under controlled conditions. And there are always a lot of gray areas there, but the idea is that there's some intervention at some point where these animals or plants are under your control. And that gray area comes about because a lot of these species are cultured for the whole life cycle. They are hatched out in a hatchery. They live their whole life in production facilities until they're harvested, or those lucky few that are selected to be the next generation of breeding stock. And so that's, every aspect of that animal is under control. Now, for some other species, especially some shellfish, you'll see where maybe the reproduction goes on naturally, and then the little larvae and what they call spat are collected and then moved to other areas to be grown out and even, protected and kept clean until they reach a harvestable size. But increasingly, on a global basis, aquaculture involves more and more control across the whole entire life cycle. There are some real interesting examples of historic, ancient fish culture ponds throughout the Pacific Islands, at places like Hawaii, where these ponds were constructed, especially with the idea that the high tides would bring in larval fish and larval crustaceans, and then they could grow them out in that pond and harvest them. And you see similar approaches, going back thousands of years. I think maybe one of the oldest examples is about 6,000 years ago. There were people in Australia that were raising eels in a network of canals and ponds. And those eels, of course, hatched out somewhere out in the ocean, and then, as is their life cycle, they come back to the rivers, and then they go up the rivers to spend most of their lives. And so these guys, simply took advantage of that natural behavior and put their canals where the eels would swim right up into the enclosed areas and live their life out right there so they could be harvested. So for thousands of years, really, aquaculture has existed. It's been evolving, but I think it's fair to say almost any form of aquaculture has to work with nature. You have to work within the boundaries of that animal's physiology, its life history, its nutritional requirements. If you're going to be successful in aquaculture, you've got to pay attention to animal welfare, and also this is a lesson that the ancient people learned, and modern industry is beginning to relearn this, that you've really got to maintain all of those natural aspects and natural resources, because once they begin to degrade, you're not going to be successful anymore. You're either going to have to just quit or go find somewhere else to do it again. The shrimp farming industry is a good example of that. A number of decades back, when it first began to take off in places Asia, they would go out into the mangroves and just tear everything up and turn it into ponds, with the idea that the money to be made would pay for that, and quite often it didn't. As the industry began to move to the Americas, we saw some of that, but not nearly as much. And like a good example is Honduras. Honduras has lots of shrimp farms, but if you go back and look at the satellite photos before all those farms were developed, you can see that most of those farms, virtually 98% of those farms were developed on salt flats where there weren't any mangroves. And you see that more and more in other parts of the world too. Like I say, it's an ancient wisdom that the modern industry is beginning to grasp and really embrace again.
It's kind of funny how it always comes a little bit full circle. It's like we just have a collective forget of what worked in the past.
We really do. We really do. And, all these concepts that are tossed around in modern aquaculture, things about sustainability, which is, also something that's hard to define depending on who you talk to. But the idea of sustainability was ingrained in the way those early people lived, and you can see that in how they began to develop aquaculture. Another good example is in China. In China, which is indisputably the leader in global aquaculture to this day, and some of the earliest aquaculture went on there. And until recent times, their idea of a balanced aquaculture system was to have a number of different species in their ponds. The modern term is polyculture. But if you had that right recipe, the right mix of different kinds of fish, some would eat the plants, some would eat the snails, some would eat the bugs, and the productivity would be much higher because you had that natural balance in that pond. And again, like you say, it's an example of people forgetting things and then relearning them, because in recent years we have this concept that's been tossed around quite a bit called integrated multi-trophic aquaculture, and it's that same ancient wisdom that someone has rediscovered, and that you're growing. Let's say, for example, you're growing fish in a cage, and then as the wastes come out of that cage, because they will, even fish in the open ocean have to poop. So this idea that aquaculture species, produce waste and wild fish don't, it doesn't add up. But in this situation with multi-trophic aquaculture, as that waste leaves those cages, it's being utilized by things like shellfish, mussels, and clams and oysters. And then the dissolved nutrients are being utilized by beds of kelp and other sorts of seaweed that are right there down current from the cages. And so you end up with a much more efficient use of the nutrients that you're putting into that system to begin with. And this is reflected in the mentality, the philosophy behind some of the things that Henry Bodden wants to do. One of these units, the idea is not just to have a cage that you put fish in and feed them until they're big enough to eat, but you have fish in the cage, you've got crabs and shellfish and oysters and things that will be living on the cage. You can put seaweed around the cage. Again, it's a more balanced, natural approach. And that may not be the way to feed the masses in the future, but you can certainly feed a lot of people that are already marginalized and don't have many resources to work with.
Well, I think there's a lot to unpack there because, we already, sink old ships or something to get structure. And it's not uncommon for in a couple of years that structure provides hiding ground for, those small larval fish to grow into something that can stay alive for long enough. And then other creatures come by and stay with it. So Henry's idea I really like, just because it kind of touches on what you just said earlier about in Hawaii. Those people, it's like if you can just build some kind of protective structure, generally there's plenty of small creatures in the ocean that just need to hide. And then if you do it in a smart way, you can kind of make like regenerative structures that are not just like pull things out, which to me, that's the biggest problem, right? It's like I was watching an episode, I think, of Rotten on Netflix, and it was talking about how in New England, like, all these different smaller fishermen have just been kind of like getting aggregated into just bigger entities just because they can't compete, but it's always just take. There's never a put back in to the equation.
Right.
And it's like, come on, it's like that's like the most basic thing is like you can't just take and then imagine that this finite resource is magically just going to keep producing. Just because the ocean's big doesn't mean it's infinite. It's like you got to kind of put back.
Exactly. And that's the basis for a term that you hear bounced around a lot in natural resource management and fisheries management. It's extractive. It's just like you say. That's the perfect summary. The perfect way to explain it. You're just taking things out, and a lot of the history of modern aquaculture began with that situation. In the United States and in Europe, most of I guess, I'd have to say 200 years ago, 150 years ago, most of the interest at that time in aquaculture was in hatcheries. Hatcheries for fish, hatcheries for lobsters, even hatcheries for oysters, because the fisheries were so extractive that a lot of the breeding stock was being impacted. And so the thought at that time was, well, that's the missing part of the puzzle. If we could put more eggs and more larvae and more juveniles out there, then we can sustain our fishery, which to some extent can be true, but that's more of a situation by situation evaluation that you'd have to make. But that was the idea, and we see that to this day. Some of that has an important basis in conservation. When we get ourselves in a bind and we have done something to destroy or destroy the habitat or overfish a species, you will see what people call conservation aquaculture going on, where they make an effort to develop the hatchery protocols for breeding stock to produce more young to put out into that habitat, which of course isn't going to work unless you make great strides in improving the habitat and getting it back to where it was to be able to support that species. But another example is salmon fisheries. In Alaska, you'll hear different estimates, but arguably 40 to 60% of the salmon in that fishery started their life in a hatchery. And in Alaska, what they term aquaculture is still not legal. You can't farm salmon in Alaska the way you would in, say, Nova Scotia or Norway or Chile or New Zealand. You can't do it in Alaska. But nonetheless, those fish it depends on who shouts the loudest, but a lot of people would say those are not wild salmon. Those salmon were born in a hatchery.
Did you have a chance to watch that artificial documentary that goes into depth about the hatcheries, especially in Alaska?
No, I haven't seen it yet.
I think you'll like it.
It's better that it's better that I don't watch it. I might get all fired up and get my blood pressure up.
Oh, there you go.
And that raises another point that aquaculture in general is the subject of so much criticism, and the industry overall has really jumped through so many hoops as it's begun to mature to try to address that and take all of these sustainability questions into account in terms of improving their feed conversion, reducing their effluents. But you have to look at the numbers. How is it that aquaculture can be criticized so much and actually try to respond? And that's because it's a growing industry. You look at how much beef the typical American eats, and I don't remember offhand, but I think it's maybe 40, 60 pounds. How much chicken the typical American eats, maybe 90 pounds a year, maybe more. I'm not sure, but I don't have those numbers right in front of me. But when you look at how much fish a typical American eats, it's very, very little. So, you won't see a lot of these organizations that generate their cash flow by criticizing and demonizing. You won't see them going after poultry or hog production or beef production in the same way, because it's a much bigger target. And people might be willing to give up their salmon fillet if they think it's for a good cause. But the way this society is structured, people can't give up their hamburgers and their chicken and their pork chops simply because, they make a lot of poop and it makes our environment dirty. Well, I tell you a secret that a lot of fish in the ocean, when you pull out 90 million tons of fish a year, those 90 million tons made an awful lot of poop. And that's not even considering the fish that weren't pulled out of the ocean. So the whole mindset is different. There is no level playing field that appreciates all the efficiencies that aquaculture brings to food production, at least not in this country. Even in Europe, they're more educated about the benefits of aquaculture than we are here in this country.
You ran one of the largest commercial aquaculture in Louisiana, right?
Yeah, we did. Yeah.
What was that like? And then if you can kind of maybe touch upon like what Europe and stuff does a little bit differently that we should probably be thinking about.
Okay. My involvement in this operation in Louisiana, it started when I was finishing up my PhD, and I was looking for a job, and I saw a little in a little obscure newsletter. I saw an ad from some company in New York City that was looking for someone to work as, I guess, for want of a better term, as a technical director for an aquaculture project that would be located in Louisiana or Mississippi. And I sent my resume, and I heard back from them, and I got hired to do this. So the very first step was to find a piece of land where we could build a farm. And at that time, ag land was pretty depressed, especially in Louisiana. So prices were pretty low. I looked at about maybe 20 different sites and picked the one that seemed the best. And we began to build ponds out there. Altogether, we built about 1,200 acres of ponds. Most of that was for catfish production. Some of it was for crawfish, and some of it was for hybrid striped bass. But again, that goes back to me feeling very fortunate to have been exposed to some of the things that I got to work with over the years, because these are things that you don't learn even in a graduate program. You don't learn, how often you've got to change the hydraulic fluid on a bulldozer. You don't learn, how to drill a deep water well, how deep you drill versus how deep you set your pump. Just so many things that you don't learn until you get out there and do it. But we built a hatchery to go along with that farm, and it was a good farm. It was a pretty good operating farm. One disadvantage that we had was we were not that close to the processing plants. You get to someplace like Mississippi and some parts of Alabama, the typical catfish farm has at least 2 or 3 processors that they could sell to at any point in time. And we didn't have that luxury. So there were some times when that farm struggled somewhat. But it was a tremendous learning experience for me. Eventually, that farm was converted to crawfish production, which is a big deal here in Louisiana. And it was part of just a big trend. The catfish industry in the United States over the last 2 decades has declined by about 50%. And part of that, you'll hear catfish producers say, a big part of that is competition from imported product. And that's true, but from my perspective, that was not the biggest cause of that huge decline. Most of that was the result of ethanol policy. And, I say that to people and they're like, well, what does one have to do with the other? Once the government established this requirement for ethanol and gasoline, the ethanol plants just popped up all over the Midwest. And what do they make ethanol out of? Corn. So they started buying up all the corn they could get their hands on. That drove the price of corn up, which in turn drove up the price of soybeans, because that's sort of the next best thing if you're trying to feed cows or chickens or any other sort of livestock. And that includes catfish. Over the course of about 18 months, a ton of catfish feed in Louisiana went from about $220 to $485. Now, some of the biggest operations in Louisiana and everywhere else, they could absorb most of that. And the operations that had shares in processing plants could absorb some of that on the other side, in the processing end. But a lot of medium and small plants, farms, just couldn't make the numbers work anymore. So that's an example of, no matter how sustainable or well operated aquaculture might be, there are a lot of policy questions that can impact it, for which there's no solution. And I'm sure, when a lot of these people were promoting ethanol, they were well-meaning people, and it seemed like the right thing to do. But one of the consequences was, a huge reduction in this country's largest aquaculture industry.
It's pretty intense how complex these systems are and how downstream second, third order effects can
Hmm.
impact a whole different industry. You know,
Yeah,
oh yeah,
yeah.
corn is good. We don't have to drill for oil, and then all of a sudden it's like, well, what about the fertilizer runoff? What about, the death of the small farmers who can't compete with the
Yeah.
big monoculture farms? What about monoculture in general? When you harvest that corn,
What?
it's disastrous. It's
Yeah.
like there's so many things.
In
It's
the
like, oh,
water demand,
oh, the
the
water
water
demand, crazy.
demand in the ethanol plants. You know, I'm not an expert on it, but I know that a lot, like you say, a lot of small farmers in the Midwest probably suffer, and a lot of single mothers in places like Belzoni, Mississippi, they suffer too because their one source of employment at the processing plant disappeared. Like you say, these downstream effects, people just don't think about them.
And sometimes they're just hard to think about. Like you could just
Yeah,
don't know that it's going to go in that direction per se, because there could be infinite number of paths. Yeah, my dad, his family was from Iowa, and we grew up on the corn and soybean farms. So I was from California, but I would go out there every summer and drive the John Deere tractor and stuff like that. But it's just crazy to
yeah,
hear what it was like when he was a kid versus, we ended up selling that farm. And now it's like when you drive through Coon Rapids, Iowa, it's like, or if you go to some of the farmlands, you're just like, well, where is the next neighbor? And it's like, oh,
yeah.
there's only two families, and they're not even families really. They're just, big commercial entities at
Hmm.
this point. You're just like, man, there's no such thing as a small farmer in some of these zones anymore.
It's true. It's true. And short of a Mad Max scenario, we're not going to get back to small farmers.
Oh no, I can't see how it's gonna switch. It's all going in
Mm-mm.
the trend of aggregation. So when you were
Yeah.
running that large commercial operation, was what was the quality of the fish? Because I think a lot of people always kind of worry about, the or they see these videos or pictures of farm fish as unhealthy. What did your thoughts on that?
You'll see some of that concern uh, in different degrees depending on the fish that you're talking about. But in this case, this was catfish production, and catfish are raised in ponds that range anywhere from maybe 8 to 15 acres. That was pretty much the size range of our ponds on that farm. And trust me, no one can afford to change out the water in those ponds. The cost of the diesel fuel or electricity would be prohibitive. And so you've got to maintain an environment in that pond that's conducive to that fish, not just for it to stay alive, but for it to thrive, for it to grow, for it to eat, for it to convert that feed in an efficient manner and not get sick. Because pathogens are everywhere. The birds bring them in, the snails carry them. They're everywhere. Just like people can catch a cold. You can't keep the disease problems out of those ponds. You've got to keep those fish in good health and have a good environment for them to live in. So the quality of our fish, I think in most all the catfish that are raised in the U.S., it was extremely high and continues to be. If not with the margins that our growers face these days, if that were not the case, the farm just simply could not stay in business. If your survival levels aren't very, very, very high, suddenly there's no profit to be made, and the bank wants its money, and the state wants its property taxes, and if you're not making money, you won't be there. So I think it's safe to say that the quality of catfish in this country is really, really high in terms of food safety and even in terms of environmental impacts. When you look at the feed that goes into these ponds, and this also applies to tilapia ponds around the world, literally, we're talking about 90% of the nutrients are processed right there in that pond. The environmental impact to the surrounding watersheds is minimal, really, really minimal. And when we compare that to the environmental impact of, say, poultry production or hog production or cattle production for that matter, unless they're grazing in a wide open space, aquaculture is miles ahead in terms of minimizing environmental impacts for the amount of protein that you're producing. That's, I'm back on my soapbox, but that's something that policymakers and some of the advocacy groups don't tend to take into account. The quality of those fish was good. But that leads me also to talk about, some of these imports that the growers blame for the reduction in our catfish industry. And that's kind of a mixed bag, because when you go to places like Asia, you do see very marginalized people with not a lot of resources that are growing fish under pretty rustic conditions, for want of a better word. Most of that, though, is to feed their families and to feed their communities. When you talk about imported product like you would find in Costco or Walmart or Sam's Club or Albertsons or Kroger or any of these big outlets, that imported product is probably scrutinized more carefully than even our domestic catfish production. And the reason why is what drives so much of our society in this country, and that's lawyers and litigation and liability. None of these big chains wants to be hit with a product liability scandal. And so, from the time that fish is put out in a pond, whether that be Vietnam or China or maybe India, until the time it is processed and packed, there are eyes looking over their shoulders just about every day. And so the quality, even if a relatively small portion of the shipments is inspected, the shipments that are bound for these big, consumer outlets, they are really well scrutinized. And the industry has taken that to another step to address some of the concerns about inspection or, are these sustainable? Were these grown with slave labor? And that is a whole arena of certification that has really taken hold over the last decade or so. We have 3 or 4 big groups that certify aquaculture operations and products as being sustainable. And the standards are pretty high, really high. And the certification body, as if you will, they're not the ones that do the inspection. There's a third party that comes in and does the inspection to make sure all of those standards are met. There's 3 or 4 of them. And, if you look when next time you're in one of these big stores and you pick up a package of imported frozen tilapia fillets or frozen swai fillets, if you look, more often than not, you're going to see a seal of certification from one of these programs. Now, that adds some cost for the producer, but it's almost a requirement now in terms of global seafood markets. If you're producing tilapia in, let's say, Ecuador or Pangasius in Vietnam or channel catfish in China. If you want to sell it in the United States or in Europe, you're going to have to do it through one of those certification programs. So that's another layer of protection for the consumer in terms of imported products.
Do you have any reservations when you're at one of these big box stores to buy any of that fish, or is it all good thanks to these programs that have been put in place?
Oh, I personally have no reservations. I'm entirely confident in the quality of that product. I've been in huge processing plants in places like Colombia, Honduras, and Mexico, and China. And honestly, those plants are every bit as modern and every bit as clean as the best plants I've seen in the Mississippi catfish industry. The standards are every bit as good, and they have to be, because it's big business, it's serious business. Now, if I were to go look for a little seafood shop somewhere, whether it's here in Louisiana or up in the Midwest, and they've got boxes of frozen tilapia, and they're from China, and maybe they've got a brand name on them, but they don't have any certification logo on that box or anything, then I'd be a little suspicious. Then I think, no, let's just go to Kroger's and buy it, or Costco. That's the segment of the market where the only thing you can rely on is those inspectors at the port, who will literally open up that container and pull out samples and check for any residues or filth or spoilage or anything like that. And that's true. The reality is they only manage to inspect a small portion of those shipments. But so that's the difference. You've got the public mechanism that's in place, that governmental mechanism, but then on the other hand, you've got the private commercial certification system where money talks and lawyers rule and litigation, and so that's where that confidence comes from when I go to buy products someplace like that.
Absolutely. Well, I want to shift gears a little bit. You said you've been to Africa a bunch of times, and where else have you been?
Yeah. Actually, I was counting it the other day. I've been to 24 different countries over the last 30 years or so. And some of those have been, pretty advanced. Places like Belgium, where I was looking at indoor fish farming, where all the water is reused and everything is controlled and automated. But I think, one of the places that turned out to be dearest to my heart was Africa, a project I worked on in Nigeria. I remember we started from scratch there also, and had to look for a suitable piece of land to develop the project. The great thing was that project was funded by Mobil Oil there in Nigeria, and they had a lot of projects like this where they were trying to help local communities become self-sufficient. For years, they'd thrown money at little projects like clinics or schools, but then, once the building was built, over the next year or two, it would just sort of fall into disrepair, and it wasn't self-sustaining. So they were shifting over to looking for things like digging wells, water wells for communities, and encouraging agriculture and encouraging fish farming. And so when we had to look for that piece of land, the oil company loaned us a helicopter and a pilot, and we literally got to fly all over the south part of Nigeria. It was wonderful. It was really cool to see everything from the air. And we picked a site and went out there and started trying to clear it so we could dig ponds. A lot of that clearing was done by hand, and a lot of the excavation was done by hand too. And these were people that really wanted to work. We had contracted a local guy to sort of be like the labor chief. He would, try to organize the workers and, tell them the rules, even the safety rules, make sure everybody was doing what they were supposed to do. But it was so interesting when you talk about how people do things in different parts of the world. We'd have the young guys would start showing up around 6 a.m. to make a line to be able to work that day. And I mean, they were lining up to work with a shovel and a machete and whatever for 8 or 9 hours. They wanted to work. I remember this one kid was there in line one morning, and he had on flip-flops and some loose-fitting pants, and he didn't have a shirt. And the work crew guy says to him, "What are you thinking? You cannot work without a shirt." And this guy pulls a cell phone. Back then, cell phones were more kind of like shoes, I guess. But he pulls out a cell phone and calls someone. And a few minutes later, they show up on a bicycle with a shirt for him. So he got to work that day. But I thought it was so funny that, this guy hardly had a shirt on his back, but he had a cell phone. And it just really impressed me that the priorities or the necessities, what people would consider a necessity in their life in a place like that. And as aquaculture has grown in Nigeria and all over sub-Saharan Africa, that has been one of the important ways to get technical information out to the producers. You can set up these networks on a cellular system where every week you can send out a newsletter saying, well, we're seeing such and such disease in this region, or temperatures are going to be hot next week, so pay attention to your oxygen levels, or, all the little things that good farming requires in terms of just that technical support. Cell phones have made a huge difference, and aquaculture is just growing like crazy in sub-Saharan Africa now, because like I said before, if they need something, they'll find a way to get it. And that's one application of the technology where it's worked really well. And cell phones they're considered, it's not an option. You've got to have it. Just like, you see that here in the U.S. with kids with their cell phones and grown-ups with their cell phones, and everyone has their cell phone. Well, we're not alone. It's like that over there too. And I can get on my cell phone and type a message in WhatsApp and chat with friends of mine in Equatorial Guinea. So the technology side of it, the information side of it, is not necessarily what's going to hold back the growth in places like that.
Yeah, it's definitely crazy how the cell phone is just such a powerful tool now, and how everybody has one. It's insane. But going into a little bit more about Africa, I know we were chatting before the podcast started a little bit about Henry's kind of invention and how you'd like to see it in Africa. Can you talk a little bit about how you think his kind of fish trap could be deployed and the benefit it could be to local communities?
Yeah, and Africa's a big place, and the people are different all around Africa. But like a good example would be places like the coast of Kenya. I have a colleague over there who is working on raising tilapia in salt water right along the coast in cages. But to go back to this concept of integrated multi-trophic aquaculture, there's a lot of other things that you can grow along with them in that same space with the same resources. And one thing that comes to mind is something that's called a sea cucumber. I've seen these things, and I don't think I could eat one. I don't think I could touch one. But they're a huge delicacy in China and other parts of Asia, and sea cucumbers. And it's the perfect animal to raise with a system like Henry's, where you're feeding one species and then using the structure and using the immediate environment to generate a lot more productivity. And the idea that you could put out thousands of these structures along the coast and support a sea cucumber industry for export and raise fish for local consumption, it's a win-win situation. And the great thing about that, especially for Africa, especially for East Africa, is suddenly they've got an export product. They can generate foreign exchange. They can bring money in, because the relationship between Africa and China is pretty one-sided right now. You see lots of Chinese businessmen looking for resources over there, components to make concrete, components to make aluminum, all sorts of things they're looking for to buy there in Africa. And they're selling ceiling fans, they're selling rubber boots, they're selling plastic chairs, they're selling motorcycles that come in a box. And this kind of technology, it's not just so you can feel good and you can, it's environmentally friendly. Oh, they have fish to eat now. It goes way beyond that, because suddenly you've got money coming from China to Africa instead of just going from Africa to China. Without losing anything, without giving away anything. So the economic implications for a lot of these coastal communities could be huge. It could really change the lives of a lot of little kids who, don't have new shoes when they need them, or can't go to school because their parents don't have any way to make any money to send them to school. So I think it's a really good way to use natural resources in a sustainable way to improve some of these livelihoods. That's just one example, but there's you go further south along the coast of Africa and you reach a point where abalone culture is a big deal. And these kinds of structures that Henry has could easily be adapted for abalone culture. Again, and have other species incorporated to utilize some of the same nutrients. So it's a passive sort of technology. It's not that hard to construct that structure, even from local materials for most of these folks. And for a little bit of inputs, you get an awful lot of outputs.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's huge. Just thinking about the scale of getting this done around the globe, per se, and how putting money into the local community could just have all these kind of downstream effects that we were talking about earlier. It's like we just can't even, you can kind of get a general idea of what could happen, but until it's being used, go through some iterations, and the technology is there, why not? So I think I hope he can get it out into the world.
Yeah, I hope so too.
Shifting to the end, I know we're coming up on some time. What resources can people look at that you recommend? Books, podcasts, magazine, trade articles, if they want to kind of learn more about aquaculture and maybe get involved?
In some ways it's encouraging, and in some ways it's depressing, because I think, aquaculture does have a downside. There are some downsides in the past. There have been some real black eyes from the way certain people have operated. So if you just go online and start looking for aquaculture, you'll see some pretty negative portraits. Some of that is partly fair. Some of it is not really realistic at all. I would go and look at some of the professional organizations that are out there. Things like a good example of one of the certification programs is you can find that through the Aquaculture Stewardship Council. That's a good place to start to look at not only some of the standards that industry has adopted, but also some news stories about how sustainability is being embraced by the industry all over the world, places like China, places like Ecuador, all over the world. That's a good place to look at, some of the realistic aspects. The Global Aquaculture Alliance has an online magazine called the Global Aquaculture Advocate. It's another good balanced source of information. They talk about the positives and they don't hide the problems that we're up against. Trying to think of some other sources. The World Aquaculture Society has a magazine called World Aquaculture. I'm not certain as to whether you can get it for free online or not, but you probably can. World Wildlife Fund, they have a whole section devoted to aquaculture development in a sustainable manner. And, there's not a lot of hype in any of these sources. It's pretty much the facts. I think some people would say, yeah, but they're pro-aquaculture. But these are the same people that, if it's not negative aquaculture, then it has to be pro-aquaculture. And that's not really the case. You'll see a lot of discussion of sustainability and, social aspects of sustainability, economic aspects of sustainability. You'll see some of the efforts that the industry is making to move away from the traditional feed sources. Instead of things like fish meal and fish oil, now they're looking at black soldier fly larvae. They're looking at microbial single-cell protein sources. They're looking at algae. Lots of feed substitution going on, and that's an industry initiative. That's that hasn't been imposed on me through any government regulation. You'll see, if you can look at some of the news stories recently, some of the major salmon farming companies and fish feed companies have pretty much sent an ultimatum to Brazil that they are not going to buy any more of their soybean meal from Brazil for their feed. And soybean meal makes up a pretty big chunk of the fish feed all around the world. And they basically said, we're not sourcing any from Brazil because you guys are cutting down the rainforest to grow your soybeans. So there is a lot of social responsibility in the industry around the world that doesn't necessarily make the headlines, especially of some of these groups that just need a boogeyman so they can ask for your donation to save the planet. A lot of aquaculture producers are already trying to save the planet and not really getting much credit for it.
Well, that's a good point. I don't think anybody really thinks about it that way, but you got to have an enemy a lot of times when it comes to asking people for money.
Exactly. Yeah.
The last question I like to ask everybody, but I'm not exactly sure. Do you fish at all, or is it no time for that anymore?
I love to fish. I don't have a problem catching a fish if I know I'm going to eat it or throw it back. So I guess I don't have a problem catching a fish because it's always one or the other. Some of the best hours of my life have been spent fishing in simple places, in ponds, in streams, maybe off a boat just offshore. I'm not an avid fisherman, but I think if I could learn to make more time for myself, I could easily become one. It is a question of time. There's so many things that I used to enjoy, fishing, playing music, painting, drawing, that I just don't do anymore, mostly because of the time constraints. And it goes back to, what all the wise people say, you have to make time. And I would encourage, everyone else, and I need to take my own advice. There's really no better way to get in touch with nature and really think about all of these aspects of environmental sustainability than fishing. You can raise a cage full of fish out in the bay and still have great fishing out there if you do it right. Some of the best fishing in the world is, and people don't know about it, a lot of people, but just going around the coast of the Mediterranean, there's a lot of great fishing. And the Mediterranean has a thriving industry of growing sea bass and sea bream in cages. So I don't see a conflict there, and I take every opportunity I can to let fishermen know that there's not necessarily a conflict there at all. I love to fish. I love to catch everything from bluegill to red drum. I've never caught any of my favorite fish. I love to eat halibut, and maybe one day I'll catch a halibut, but by then I may not be able to get it in the boat. I don't know.
Well, I hope you have a chance to go to Alaska and get one of those barn door Pacific halibuts that are 600 pounds.
That'd be something. Even a 20-pound would be fine.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you have to shoot them just to get them in the boat because they're too dangerous to put on the deck.
Yeah.
But if you ever come to Southern California, I could take you California halibut in the shore. They're a lot smaller, but they're still fun to catch.
Yeah. That's my favorite fish. Okay, I got that on my bucket list now.
Perfect. Well, thanks, Professor. I appreciate your time and sharing all of your knowledge in aquaculture and your travels around the world. Really appreciate it.
Oh, it's no trouble. I enjoyed it. That's the most enjoyable hour I've had in the last couple of weeks.
Awesome. How can people find you if they wanted to reach out? Do you have a Twitter, a Facebook, or how can they search for you?
Well, probably the best way to find me, I've got a little page. I work at Louisiana State University, and so if you just search for Greg, Greg Lutz, Lutz, you could probably find me there. I'm also the editor-in-chief of Aquaculture Magazine, so you could find me there. And I'm definitely not hard to find. Either one of those. If you wanted to Google and just say Greg Lutz Aquaculture, I'm sure you can find me. And I've got several different emails, so I'm easy to find.
Perfect. I'll put that information in the show notes. Really appreciate your time.
Oh, no trouble. I enjoyed meeting you and chatting with you.
Well, that does it for this episode of the podcast. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Thank you, Professor Lutz, for sharing your wisdom. I'm always looking for ways in which we can take care of our oceans and other waterways so we can fish more and make sure that we have fish for future generations. If you have any big ideas, I'd love to hear them. Just hit me up on castandspear.com/contact or leave a comment on iTunes. I read them all. And if you're already there, if you could leave a rating so other people can see this podcast, that'd be super helpful and much appreciated. Well, with that being said, I hope you're catching a lot of fish out there. Tight lines, everyone. See ya.